One of the ways that you can feel connection very deeply and profoundly is to alter your chemistry.
This is our humble hemp patch.
5,000 years of medical cannabis use.
We're learning about other cannabinoids.
Marijuana is grown in every state in the Union.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. Humans are social creatures, and we need to be connected with others. Trauma and isolation go hand in hand. Dr. Julie Holland is a brilliant psychedelic psychiatrist who understands both the chemical and the emotional side of human relationships. If we don't feel connected enough, if we have trouble forming relationships, or if we're haunted by past experiences, she has studied what your brain needs to rebalance that relationship with the world, from the personal level to your community and out to the cosmos. We'll travel from oxytocin to the endocannabinoid system, from unity with nature to unity with your partner, which might be the harder one to achieve. From the sympathetic nervous system to the parasympathetic nervous system, Julie Holland is one of my favorite people for navigating this map. No need to fight or flight. Let's make a connection with her right now. Also, stay tuned after the interview because I'm going to share 7 tips from Julie's book about how to activate your parasympathetic system. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with Dr. Julie Holland. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You've written a lot of great books. Weekends at Bellevue, 9 Years on the Night Shift at the Psych ER, Ecstasy, The Complete Guide, The Pot Book, A Complete Guide, and Moody Bitches, The Truth About Drugs You're Taking, The Sleep You're Missing, The Sex You're Not Having, and What's Really Making You Crazy, which is as good as its title suggests. I really love that book. But today we're here to talk about your new book, Good Chemistry, and the focus is on connections. And so I think the first thing I wanted to ask was, why psychedelics for connections and why right now?
Oh, excellent questions. So, the book is about the science of connection and sort of getting into the biology of how we're wired for connection and why it feels so good to us, how it feels so good to us, and how to keep creating that good chemistry through connection. But one of the ways that you can feel connection very deeply and profoundly is to alter your chemistry. So the subtitle of the book, Good Chemistry, is The Science of Connection from Soul to Psychedelics. And the way the book is set up is the first chapter is about connecting with the self. So you're talking about becoming embodied and also sort of integrated, that you integrate your trauma and your repressed self or your shadow self. So it's all about sort of connecting with your soul. And then the second chapter is about connecting with a partner, and then connecting with a family, and then community, and then a chapter on connecting with nature. And then the last chapter is about connecting with the cosmos, connecting with death. And that's really where I speak about psychedelics the most, as this is a chapter of life where psychedelics can be incredibly helpful, which is coming to terms with the existential dread or anxiety around dying. So what's great about psychedelics is that they give you, not everybody, but many people will have a mystical experience and will have at some point during the experience this sense of oneness, that everything is connected and that you are connected to everything. And that's a really powerful feeling to have. It's very intense and it can be transformative for people. So oneness and connection, really good for the body, really good for our psyches. So I wanted to try to write a book to explain, sort of show all these different levels of oneness and connection that you can have. Even if you're totally alone, you can still feel as one or at peace with yourself and to feel connected with your body and your story.
And that's what I really enjoyed about the book, was that it felt hermetic almost, as above, so below. You start with yourself, but then you use that same kind of treatment on your partners, on your friends, on your family, and then your community and your ecosystem and your universe, and pulling it all together. And you talked a lot about oxytocin, which is a neurotransmitter that's kind of in the news, but it's not sexy like serotonin and dopamine is. So can you talk about how oxytocin plays into this story and how it might be related to psychedelics?
Yeah, although I'm obsessing about the fact that I didn't answer the second half of your question, which is why now. But I'll talk about it now, about why now. So yes, oxytocin. It's a sexy chemical, and I think that a lot of us have heard about it off and on, and it comes up. But I think you're going to be hearing about it more. So, and why oxytocin really has to do with now, I think, is interesting. So oxytocin is it's a hormone, but it's also a neurotransmitter, right? So, which means it works within the brain, but it also works within the rest of the body. And it is sort of more active in general in an estrogen rich environment. So it is fair to say that this may be more of an issue for women than men. There's something called an oxytocin vasopressin pathway. And these two hormones are in, everybody has a sort of proprietary balance. And it may be that really men have more vasopressin and less oxytocin, and women it's the other way around. But these are hormones that enable certain social behaviors to happen. So oxytocin really helps to enable trust and bonding and intimacy and a feeling of connection. And not only that, but it enables connection to feel good. And I think, Lex, you'll be interested in this part. Like, how does oxytocin, like, why does a hug feel good, or cuddling? And you can say, oh, well, that oxytocin is enabling the cuddling and the hugging. But the oxytocin is also enabling the pleasure. And the pleasure really comes from the endocannabinoid system and also the endorphin system. And again, everybody has sort of their proprietary blend of good chemistry. And yes, there are things like serotonin and dopamine that can make us feel good. Oxytocin helps us to make sure that social connection feels good. And it is through the endorphins and endocannabinoids. And one of the things I talk about in good chemistry is that there are some, I guess I could call them drugs of abuse. It's not my favorite term. There are some drugs that people use that mimic the good chemistry that they would get if they were feeling connected or if they were feeling held or safe or loved. Um, Opiates is a great example. I think some people who have sort of experienced the pleasure of opiates will describe it as saying that, it feels like a warm hug, or, I mean, the extreme version of that is someone I think once described heroin as being kissed by God. So, but certainly a sense of intimacy and being held and feeling safe and warm. And there are other drugs that can mimic really intense forms of like high oxytocin states. For instance, MDMA, right? We know that MDMA increases oxytocin levels. We know that a lot of people, when they have a good experience with MDMA, they may feel very open, loving, trusting, or connected, right? I mean, when you're dancing on the dance floor, or you're at a concert or just a large gathering, and there are other people dancing, and maybe you've taken some ecstasy, or perhaps you call it Molly, and you sort of feel like, you love everybody around you, you feel connected with everybody around you, you sort of feel one with the other people dancing and reveling. That's really a heady experience. And that is sort of oxytocin enabled and oxytocin mediated. Uh, and I there's lots of different ways to feel a sense of oneness, and I would say that they are all really good for your body. They all help to put you in the parasympathetic state, which is the exact opposite of fight or flight.
And actually, that's great because I wanted to ask about that next because
Perfect.
it seems like oxytocin is so highly conserved in an evolutionary sense because it's so important to feel connected. For most creatures, being with your group and your tribe helps keep you safe.
Right.
Good old Peter Kropotkin and mutual aid kind of thinking. And so it also can help, it seems, calm you down from the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic response you could have. So could you just lay those out for people who haven't heard much about
Yeah.
them?
So, yes, I would love to. And that's one of the main reasons I wrote this book, is because I feel like the parasympathetic nervous system does not get enough attention. And everybody knows about fight or flight. And, when I was like I don't know, from middle school to medical school, I've been taught about fight or flight like a dozen times, over and over. And it was always sold to me as like, this is the key to survival and survival of the fittest. You have to be able to fight or you have to be able to run away. And that's how you survive. And there was some part of me that always wanted to call bullshit on that. Because that's not how I get by. So the truth is that we really need the flip side of the sympathetic nervous system, the opposite of fight or flight. And so the chemistry of fight or flight is basically adrenaline and cortisol. And if you need a burst of energy because you're running away from a tiger, your blood sugar is going to go up because your brain and your muscles need fuel, and your blood pressure is going to go up to make sure that you've got enough blood to get everywhere it needs to go, and your heart rate is going to go up, and you're going to be very awake and alert and a little bit paranoid because you're in this kind of kill or be kill mode, right? And that's all fine, like I said, if a tiger is chasing you or if you're in the middle of a hunt, but you don't want to be in this sympathetic fight or flight mode for most of your day. You want to be in the other side, and the other side is the parasympathetic. And as opposed to adrenaline cortisol, the fuel really for the parasympathetic nervous system is oxytocin. And instead of fight or flight, you think about rest, digest, and repair, right? So it's easier to sleep, it's easier to metabolize your food, and your body can initiate like the self-repair protocols that really don't get run when you're in the sympathetic mode. The other important thing is social graces kind of go out by, put it this way, it's like, if there's a fire in your kitchen, you don't stop to answer the phone or chat with somebody. You know, you've got a job to do. So in general, when you're in fight or flight, you're more closed down and paranoid. You don't take in information as well. You definitely don't learn and grow. There's no neuroplasticity, right? The real neuroplasticity is enabled by oxytocin. So you have to be in this parasympathetic mode to rest, digest, repair, be social, and learn. And the last thing I will say, until you ask me something else, is that when we are isolated or ostracized or shunned, when we're not connected to the group, we are naturally in the sympathetic mode. We are in fight or flight because we're sort of hardwired. Our species is categorized as obligatorily gregarious, which means we have to be social to survive. And if you're not part of the pack, you're more likely to get picked off, or you can't build a shelter, or you can't find food. Their survival comes with cooperation. So if you're disconnected, isolated, ostracized, shunned, you are sort of naturally you're going to be in fight or flight. You're not going to be in parasympathetic. So the more you feel taken care of, seen, the more you belong to something, the more you feel a sense of unity or oneness with something, the calmer you're going to be, the safer you're going to feel, more oxytocin, more parasympathetic, more neuroplasticity, less inflammation. It's better for your blood pressure, your blood sugar, your immune system. There's just so many reasons to keep yourself in parasympathetic. And there's some of the drugs that we use that I consider to be therapeutic that can help put you in the parasympathetic mode.
Would cannabis be at the top of that list?
It
You
would.
always write about cannabis so well.
I do. It does
yes.
make it into my writing. Sometimes it inspires my writing. So there's a lot of cannabis in this book, in Good Chemistry, for sure. Yeah. And I talk about the opiate sort of epidemic, overdose crisis in terms of disconnection, isolation, and the fact that opiates really do mimic what it feels like to be sort of held and like you belong.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I talk about cannabis a ton in Good Chemistry. It comes up a lot. It is a medicinal plant that can help you be in the parasympathetic mode, that can help you feel connected, right? I mean, sometimes I find that cannabis helps me feel very connected to my body. I feel like I get more easily embodied and pay more attention to my posture, for instance, if I've had cannabis. And the other thing I find is that it really helps me connect with nature. If I go out into the woods or the swamp, like I really appreciate my surroundings more. I feel connected to my surroundings more. And I can get this sort of, I don't know, maybe this will sound a little crunchy granola, but like a child of the universe, like there's this Desiderata poem, and it's like you're a child of the universe and you belong here and you're like the trees and the stars. And so I think that cannabis helps me feel sort of more connected to nature. And I know that can help you get into the parasympathetic mode.
And just to stay on cannabis for a second, what about the double-edged sword property of cannabis? What would you say for the people who find it that can make life more difficult? Or actually, I think for some people, cannabis can be more isolating because they're already feeling alone, and it's a way to kind of bow out and just be smoking it versus, using it for connection.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, we are living through, unprecedented times of isolation and disconnection right now, unfortunately. And it's going to take its toll. I mean, psychically, there's so many levels to the pandemic, and that there's this sort of primary fear that you're going to catch an invisible bug that's going to kill you, and that's a pretty big trauma. But then there's the trauma of the physical distancing and the social isolation. I mean, I have patients who live alone in New York City who have gone without human touch for 3+ months now, and nobody has ever sort of been faced with a situation. So my patients, I definitely find that they are self-soothing in all sorts of ways, and people are eating comfort foods, or they're throwing themselves into physical fitness regimens, or they're smoking more cannabis, or they're drinking more, quarantinis, and there are all sorts of things going on with people either trying to distract themselves and escape from themselves and their situations, or numb themselves to their situations. But on the other hand, I do feel pretty strongly that what we need now is resilience and adaptability and flexibility and constant calibration. And I do feel like more than many other drugs or substances or plant medicines, cannabis really helps to enable that. It physiologically helps with resilience and with rebuilding and with running the repair protocols and with de-stressing, and it sort of fights cortisol. So I'm certainly not faulting anybody if they find that they're smoking more cannabis during these times. And I understand that there is this sort of question of interaction, between a SARS-CoV-2 infection, that leads to COVID-19, and how CBD or cannabis can interact with that infection, whether it makes you more susceptible to infection, whether it makes you less susceptible to cytokine storm. I look to the research in Israel quite a bit, but there's really interesting research coming out from basically everywhere but our country. It's the short answer. People looking at this, it's a really important, interesting question. Is what is an intersection of cannabis and this virus? But I know I'm getting off point, and you're asking about people who don't get into parasympathetic with cannabis. Either they get anxious from it, right? Which some people don't really respond well to cannabis, or some people respond well to very low doses, but not what other people would consider a medium dose, or some people really don't respond well to edibles. So I think it's a matter of finding the lowest possible dose that does give you some relief from stress or distress. Um, but if you're one of these people who always gets anxious or paranoid from cannabis, then I suggest that you try CBD. I mean, a lot of my patients are taking CBD. I'm sure you and I have talked about this before, but I think for anxiety or for ADD issues of distractibility or trouble with attention or focus, my patients use CBD in order to obtain sort of a calm focus. So it ends up taking the place a lot of times of benzos like Xanax and Ativan and Valium and Klonopin. It also can take the place of stimulants like Adderall and Vyvanse and Ritalin. That's a lot for my patients, and it's great when my patients can switch over to CBD from some of the other medicines they were taking. That was a big answer. Sorry. I
No,
just
that's a great answer.
went off
Thank
on
you.
3 different directions.
And it's fascinating to see the array of effects with CBD. Those are very different neurotransmitter systems: uppers, downers, sidewaysers.
I know. Well, that's what's
And
so interesting. Yeah.
wow.
That it's like, I mean, it's like a utility player, it's like a shortstop. I mean, it really, and I think that that's one of the reasons why people look at it sort of askance and be like, how can CBD do all these things? And because it's, how can it help with anxiety, but also help with focus and concentration? But that's really what makes it unique from other anti-anxiety medicines, because most anti-anxiety meds take you down a notch or two in terms of how sharp or focused you are. So it really is significantly different there. But the other thing I want to mention about people getting anxious when they use cannabis that it's always important to keep in mind is that because it is really a sort of, a minor psychedelic as opposed to a major psychedelic, the way they used to call tranquilizers major and minor. And the minor were the benzos, and the major were the antipsychotics. So I think of cannabis as being a psychedelic, but that means set and setting really matter. And our nation's drug policy is the setting that is more conducive to paranoid or anxious responses. And so if you have a situation where you are comfortable where you are and you don't feel like you have to hide it and you don't feel like you have to have shame about it, you're already in a better setup where you're not going to be so anxious and you're not going to be so fearful about who knows I'm doing this right now. So, I think that, for instance, in a setting like Amsterdam, where it's, you're in a coffee shop or something and there are people sort of openly smoking the way that somebody would openly, have a glass of wine, and there's no shame. And I would assume that there would be fewer sort of panic attacks or anxiety responses or paranoia in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
Although the pot is pretty strong in Amsterdam. So, and THC CBD ratio, I think, matters when you're talking about these anxiety or panic responses.
Yes. And actually, that was a question I was going to ask later, but this is a good spot now because you've worked with veterans with PTSD, and in that work, you've looked at CBD versus THC ratio. So I was wondering what you found as a psychiatrist was helpful.
Well, the short answer is that the data was pretty inconclusive from the study, and it hasn't yet been published. And I was the medical monitor of Sue Sisley's study, where we were giving either high THC or high CBD or 1-to-1 smoked cannabis to veterans with PTSD. But the quality of the study drug was not fabulous. I'm like, how can I say this? Not get in too much trouble. First of all, Dr. Sisley and I kept referring to it as the study drug as opposed to calling it cannabis, because it's just like, it wasn't green, it was brown. And, it was the kind of cannabis that like a teenager would basically turn their nose up at. And like somebody really old would be like, oh, I remember this pot used to look like this in the 70s, So it's hard. It was very difficult to get good data given the study drug that we were working with. And that unfortunately is most of the story there. But there are luckily, again, other countries have got data, and there's lots of preclinical data with animal models of PTSD that show that both CBD and THC can help symptoms of PTSD. There's a lot of alphabet soup there. I'll say it again. Both CBD and THC can help the symptoms of PTSD. The symptoms of PTSD are pretty varied, right? There's some that are sort of this agitation where you've got hypervigilance and you have trouble sleeping and you've got nightmares or flashbacks, and it's sort of an activated, agitated state. But there's other parts of PTSD where people sort of don't care about the future. They're not engaged, they're sort of withdrawn. So, and different people have different again, everybody's got their proprietary blend of neurochemicals, their proprietary blend of symptoms of how they express the fact that they've been traumatized. And, we're all going to get much more aware of PTSD moving forward, because people are being traumatized left and right now. And, the medical first responders are being traumatized, and there's all kinds of racial trauma that's been happening for centuries, but is really kind of coming to a head now. We're all going to get a lot more familiar with what PTSD looks like, and we're going to need a lot better treatments than we have right now. In psychiatry, the SSRIs are pretty lousy at treating PTSD, and you don't really want to be throwing a lot of benzos at people for all kinds of reasons. And it's a tough thing to treat, because really all the medicines are just kind of plugging up holes and sealing over cracks and sweeping the dirt under the rug. And what you really need to do with PTSD is, as I've said before, you got to take the rug up and take it out back and beat the hell out of it. And then while the room is bare, you got to sweep the floor, and then you put the rug back down. And this sort of sweeping the dirt under the carpet is what a lot of medicines in psychiatry do. They treat the symptoms, they don't treat the cause. So the thing about PTSD is you really have to dissect the trauma. If you think of it as like some sort of malignant thing, you got to cut down to where the malignancy is, and you got to get it out, and you have to examine it, and try to sort of part of processing trauma is you need to integrate it and accept it and sort of fully own it, as opposed to segregating it off and saying, that didn't happen, or, well, it didn't happen to me. So you have to kind of just reach some level of acceptance of integrating the trauma. And the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy research is showing that this is really a better way to treat PTSD, right? That you have these MDMA-assisted psychotherapy sessions, 2 or 3 of them, over a several-month period, but you really dig down and get to the trauma, and you don't just debrief it. You sort of reconsolidate the memory so that it has less fear around it. And the high oxytocin states that MDMA enable, they quiet down the amygdala, they tamp down the fear response, they enable neuroplasticity. But because of that methamphetamine base, you're awake, you're alert, you want to talk, you want to connect, you're willing to dig and look and figure things out and verbalize them and convey them, because it's a tiny bit speedy. And then the other issue with MDMA is, of course, it's a huge sort of serotonin agonist or flood or depleter. Your brain, this is a metaphor, but you can think about that the synapses are sort of awash in more serotonin than usual. So there is this sense of calm and satiety, like you have everything that you need, to go along with being awake, alert, and wanting to talk and wanting to dig and figure things out. There is this sense of calm, and the amygdala is really significantly quieted, which is the brain's fear center. And that is really courtesy of oxytocin. So I've said this before, I'll say it again, like you could not design a better drug to augment the psychotherapy process than MDMA. I mean, it's just exquisite. And that's why we're seeing this really strong data with the PTSD studies, that MDMA assisted psychotherapy really helps people when they're done with the studies of, a good percentage of them, and it lasts. But there's a high percentage of people who no longer meet criteria for the study. They couldn't get in again because they don't have the symptoms of PTSD that got them into the study in the first place. And, in other lines of work, you would say that people are cured, but we don't like to say cure in psychiatry for some reason. And maybe it is, it's a big pharma reason, because if you're cured, you're not going to take your daily dose. And we're definitely seeing that people with PTSD are not needing their medicines when they're coming through the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trials.
And one of the interesting things to me about the data from those trials is often that the lower dose is the one that's more effective for psychotherapy.
Surprise, right? I was really surprised. I had heard for years and years and years, since the 80s, that 125 milligrams was the standard dose. And then if you give a booster, you give about half that. But it turns out people who've been severely traumatized, who have really severe post-traumatic stress disorder, do better on the lower dose of 75 or 80. And that was something that really became very clear with the phase 2 trials. And so with the phase 3 trials, you actually have a choice. The first one is 80, but then the second one could be 80 or 120. So you can sort of move up a little. But the first one, and so I think, for, officially, don't try this at home, but I understand that people do sometimes take MDMA in underground contexts or, in recreational contexts. And so it is something, that should be, the word should be spread, that if you are somebody who has a lot of trauma and you are trying to get some sort of a hold of that, and hopefully you're not doing this alone, but you really may need a significantly lower dose than we always thought. So yeah, that's some new information that needs to be disseminated.
Hey folks, it's sponsor time. The company is Stevie Sciences, the product is Plus CBD, and the discount code for 20% off is Lex Files. And remember, the top 3 reasons to use that code on pluscbdoil.com. Number 1, I would give Plus CBD to your grandmother because I gave it to my grandmother. Number 2, I was the biggest skeptic. Then I started studying the endocannabinoid system. Number 3, I know firsthand that CV Sciences is committed to pure science and to enhancing well-being. So when you find yourself in need of CBD from true agricultural hemp, consider Plus CBD, the number 1 CBD brand in the United States. That coupon code is Lex Files, and the place to use it is pluscbdoil.com. And I wanted to ask just about your perspective of watching MDMA for so long, because you wrote a research paper on MDMA when you were in college.
Right.
And then that played out into, I believe, your first book. So you've been paying attention to the underground use for a lot of years, and now you've been watching it become closer and closer to an approved medicine by the FDA. What's it been like from the early years when you first heard about it?
Well, it's, I have been like Johnny One Note since 1985. I mean, as soon as I heard about this, I was like, oh my God, this could be so useful for psychiatry. I wasn't even a psychiatrist yet. I was just a pre-med. So, I mean, I knew I wanted to be a doctor, and I was very interested in drugs and the brain. And I was very fortunate to be in college and spending a summer. I was living, I went to Penn, and I was actually living in a building that was called the Castle, that totally looks like a castle. It's like in the middle of the campus at Penn. And I was spending the summer taking extra classes. And that was the summer when it got emergently scheduled and became illegal. And then all these psychiatrists started sort of coming out of the woodwork and being like, oh, actually, I was working with this and it was working really well. And if you make this illegal, I'm not going to be able to do this work. So I wrote a paper that summer because I had a class that required a paper. And, of course, the assignment was like 3 or 4 page paper or whatever. I handed in like this 40-page, research tome on MDMA because I just went down just a million rabbit holes. And I love writing research papers. And, like Moody Bitches has 40 pages of notes. Good Chemistry has 60 pages of notes. They're all online. A lot of them are like hot links to whole papers because like, those are the rabbit holes I love going down is, what paper did they reference? And then you read that paper and you look at those references and you just go, go, go. So that's my gift to any nerd out there for Good Chemistry, is that there's 60 pages of notes and references online at naturalmood.com.
Yeah,
Anyway, what were we asked? What were we talking about?
It was amazing about that.
Oh yeah. 30 years. Okay. So here's what I will say is like, in the mid 80s, I was very focused on disseminating information about MDMA assisted psychotherapy and about harm reduction, needle exchange, condom availability, right? Because HIV was just starting, supervised injection facilities. Like these were things. Oh, and, end of life, sort of psychedelics end of life, and also like, euthanasia. So like, as a pre-med in undergrad, I became very interested in all these things, and it never went away. I never like said, oh, it doesn't matter anymore. Like it's still, I'm still kind of talking about the same things. And I will tell you that I do feel very vindicated and validated that some of the things that I was pretty sure about in the mid 80s, like medical cannabis and MDMA assisted therapy and harm reduction and, the widely available condom and needles. I mean, I actually got an F on a paper at Penn because I wrote all about how condoms and clean needles should be, available at any drugstore to anybody who wants them. And they were like, this is ridiculous and unrealistic. And it's like, what do you think now, pal? It's like, so I love that things that I care really deeply about are coming to pass, and I'm glad that I'm still healthy and not yet demented, and can still appreciate everything that's happening. And it's taken a long time, but I've always known that this is like a long game, and I just I've been having to sort of argue and defend myself to a lot of people for a long time, and now more and more I don't have to explain it and destigmatize it and argue for it. And it's great. I love it.
Wow, that is great. And I would guess that your patients are also knowing more when they come to you about these kind of things. And I know you can't administer these kind of things in your private practice, but do you have people come to you who want to integrate an outside experience they had on a psychedelic?
There's a lot of things that people are coming to me for that are really tricky because there are there are treatments that I think would be very effective for people, but they're not yet legal. So one of the things that I often do in my practice is I refer people to a ketamine clinic or a physician who works with ketamine because it's a good, completely legal, completely above ground way to start to have a sense that altered states of consciousness can help yield up things that you can process when you are less altered. So, and that's the idea. There's a lot of different kinds of integration, but one kind of integration is that whatever you learn in this altered state, you're going to spend some time figuring out how to sort of integrate that into your life. Um, but I do have people who have gone ayahuasca circles or have worked with underground therapists, and they um, need to integrate what they've figured out, or people who want to do that work but they're on medicines. And this is a really big issue that's coming up more and more, right? Because more and more people are on meds, and it's a lot of people who are on meds who would like to get off meds, and they see that a way to get off meds and not have a daily dose is to have these profound experiences, but you can't have these profound experiences if you're on these meds. So people have to be tapered slowly and carefully off the meds, and somebody's got to really keep an eye on them. And then if it feels like they're still stable, then they can go have this kind of work done. But the other thing that we're seeing, and it hasn't been published yet, but it's going to become widespread, understood, and it's actually really terrible, is that people who have been on SSRIs for decades may have a blunted response to MDMA assisted psychotherapy, even when they come off the SSRIs. That maybe we're just not waiting long enough, or maybe it doesn't ever completely come back up. But I mean, it makes sense if you think about down regulation and the way these medicines work. But wouldn't it be just terrible if the people who could really benefit from this medicine can't have a full blown experience because of the legal pills that they were given, are going to get in the way of the illegal medicine that's going to work better. So uh, stay tuned. This has not completely been worked out, but that may be what is happening. And if you talk to some, I've been talking to underground therapists trying to get a handle on this, and I'm definitely hearing from some people that the people who are on meds and get off meds to have these experiences, they're not always having as a full blown an experience as you would think that they would have. So it may just take more time to sort of to have the down regulation sort of upregulate again, for things to normalize. But it's a bit concerning.
And I want to ask more about that class of drugs. But before I do, just the safety thing that you're so good at. If someone was going to be taking MDMA either recreationally or for self-therapeutic use, what are the biggest contraindications that they should know of medicines they shouldn't be on,
Right.
and things to be careful of?
Well, I mean, the first thing I have to say is that, I hope that what you have is MDMA and not something else. And I hope that you're testing to figure out exactly what you have and how much of what you have, because that will decrease the risk considerably. But all the SSRIs, the prescription antidepressants that block the serotonin, the selective serotonin reuptake site, or the SSRI stands for either selective or specific, depending on how old you are, serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it sits on that reuptake site, which is exactly where MDMA needs to go. So all the SSRIs prevent you from feeling MDMA primarily. And you can override it, but you shouldn't. They don't go well together. And in the studies, we taper people off their SSRIs well before they're going to be having the MDMA assisted psychotherapy experiences. There's also an antidepressant called Wellbutrin that seems to also block MDMA and get in the way of MDMA working. So those are sort of the main ones, but there are all kinds of other medicines that aren't good to combine with MDMA. Basically, no medicine is good to combine with MDMA. But if you are on a mood stabilizer, there are some mood stabilizers that are safe to combine. But again, if you're on a mood stabilizer, I would really want you working with whoever is prescribing the mood stabilizer to figure out whether this is a good idea or not for you. Because people with bipolar disorder, people of any history of any kind of psychotic symptoms, or a first degree family member, right? Somebody in your nuclear family or very close to you, blood relative, who's got a history of bipolar or any kind of psychotic symptoms, people who hear voices or who have paranoid delusions. It's safer if you do not ingest MDMA, if that is your history or a blood relative's history.
That's good advice. And actually, I'll include. I've found a great roundup a few years ago of the things to watch out for with MDMA interactions, and so
Oh,
I'm
and
going to put that in the episode notes.
dextromethorphan for sure is a big no-no. Cough syrup.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Though, yeah, I wonder how many people are combining robotripping and MDMA,
Yeah.
but probably a good number.
Really not a good
combined.
combination. Definitely
Yeah.
dangerous combination.
And so the other thing that you can explain so well as a psychopharmacologist who really studies how drugs work in the brain, and you talked about how many meds are being used these days. Can you give a rundown of what these meds actually feel like when you see people taking them? We hear things like Prozac and the benzodiazepines, but what do you see in your practice of how these are affecting people, the major classes of them?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a spectrum, right? First of all, there are some people who absolutely need antidepressants and really can't function without them. And I don't want to, try to take away anybody's blankie. It's just that there is this whole other segment of our nation's society, women in particular, who are sort of over pathologized, over medicated. They're taking antidepressants that they don't necessarily need to take. And what I wrote about quite a bit in Moody Bitches is that there is a natural cyclicity, and it is normal and natural to have a few days every month where you feel pretty crappy. But if you feel crappy for the entire month, then something major is going on and you're probably going to need medications. 80% of antidepressants in the United States of America are prescribed by people who aren't psychiatrists. So it's important to keep that in mind, that it's really easy to hand over an antidepressant when somebody comes to your office and says they're having trouble sleeping and they're stressed out. And it's much harder to really sit down and try to figure out everything that's going on that's putting this person into sympathetic versus parasympathetic.
Good. Thank you for that.
But I'm afraid I didn't answer your last question very well.
Well,
it was
a big
sort of
one.
asking about how do the medicines feel? Oh, I think what you may have been trying to get to, and I should have continued on this. Women are being over medicated. But one of a few main side effects of the SSRIs is that it's very hard to cry. It's hard to sort of outwardly express your emotions. You may still notice them or think about them, but your eyes don't leak as easily as they used to. So you're not always giving feedback about how you really feel, which can enable a really crappy situation to continue. I wrote this an op-ed for New York Times many years ago called "Medicating Away Women's Feelings," and it was about a patient who called me crying from work and saying she needed to be on a higher dose of her antidepressant because she didn't want to be crying at work. And I could have just bumped her up, but I was like, well, what happened? And she told me this terrible story about how her boss completely humiliated her publicly and basically emasculated her, except there's no word for that when you do it to a woman, but she disempowered her and publicly, and she felt humiliated and terrible. And I was like, if I give you more medicine and you don't cry, then this guy just learns he can be a dick and in front of everybody and treat you like shit. So I'm like, I'm not necessarily going to do that. I think it's important that he gets feedback that his behavior was very upsetting to you because his behavior is not good. So I don't want to just medicate you more so that you can accommodate him and be stuck in this bad situation. So I ended up writing an article about that because it really struck me, how women are sort of, pretzeling themselves so that they don't upset men, with all their expressed emotion, because men, unfortunately, and hopefully less now, but for a long time, boys were taught to repress their emotion and to stuff it down, and that being emotional is bad. And so, they reject it in themselves, they reject it in other people. And it really is this, my partner, Jeremy Wolf, talks about this a lot, that it is a suppression of yin energy and it is a cancer of yang energy. There's a tremendous imbalance in our culture with an emphasis on yang and doing and penetrative energy. And, you're a pussy if you're just like sitting back and waiting and looking and, I'm going to take in information before I act, it's like, then you're not being a man. So, but, it's very yin to be receptive and to gather information and then to integrate and decide what you're going to do instead of just sort of jump on it. So again, going on a tangent, but these medicines make it harder to cry. They suppress yin energy. That's what I'm getting at. They also make it harder to climax, right? And I'll tell you, some women have a hard enough time already, and the last thing that they need is to be even less sort of in touch with their sexual pleasure. It makes it harder to feel sexual pleasure, most of the SSRIs, and it makes it much more difficult to reach an orgasm. And for some people, when they get off the SSRIs, they still can't come. And that's like terrifying. But Google it up, it's a real thing. So the medicines, again, some people really need them, but some people are totally inappropriately medicated and they don't need to be on medicines. But they do need to make changes in, how they sleep or whether they're exercising, what kind of foods they're eating, and they need to look at their childhood trauma because that's driving a lot of the symptoms. And speaking of childhood trauma, I would like to say that the United States of America has tremendous childhood trauma that it needs to unearth and debrief and process and integrate, such as the genocide of the native peoples who were here before the colonials showed up, and what we did to the people from Africa, and what we did to the people from Japan, and what we did to the people from China. We treated our immigrants like shit, and we still treat people of color like shit. And it's traumatizing to be a person of color in America. And America has tremendous childhood trauma that needs to be processed. And our president has tremendous childhood trauma that needs to be processed. So we all have a lot of work to do. And I think that MDMA assisted psychotherapy, psilocybin assisted psychotherapy, ayahuasca ceremonies, these things are becoming more popular, more of the zeitgeist, because they are more needed now than ever.
And that's one of the last questions I wanted to ask before I let you go was, for people who are intrigued by the things that you're talking about and who might not have the will or the means to go see a professional about it, what would you do? What would you recommend to people who want to gently start exploring this stuff on their own? What advice would you have for them?
Well, I think that knowledge is power, and we are all sort of hunter gatherers of information now. I saw a word recently I loved that said infovore. Like, I'm an infovore. So I would say become an infovore and become very educated about how these things work and what your options are. But right now, things are illegal. And so, you really have to tread carefully if you can't get into a research study. And especially right now with the pandemic, I mean, all clinical research is definitely grinding to a halt at the moment. The best thing you can do is really read and learn more. Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, I thought was excellent. I think my book, Good Chemistry, is a good complement to Mr. Pollan's book. It certainly discusses MDMA quite a bit more. It discusses oxytocin and neuroplasticity and things like orgasm and childbirth and nursing, just all, discussing the sort of issue of connection. I do think that erowid.org, EROWID.org, they're my absolute favorite source of reliable drug information. So erowid.org is a good place to start. And also, if you're the kind of person who can read scientific articles, I love to go to like Google Scholar and try to educate myself and look at the double-blind placebo-controlled trials to see how many milligrams per kilogram they used or what the setup was or these sort of things. You can actually get a lot of information from reading the original papers. And if you go to drholland.com or naturalmood.com and click on Good Chemistry, you've got 60 pages of notes and links to papers right there. That would be not a bad place to start.
And that's a perfect answer, because my last question was actually that in a little wider scale. Who were the first thinkers who really turned you on and helped you think about these drugs in a different way? The books or the luminaries in this world?
Well, there's a special place in my heart for Terence McKenna. My husband Jeremy and I met at a party for Terence, and it was a really crazy, magical moment. I wrote about it in Weekends at Bellevue because it was just, that whole night was such magic. And also Terence has got just the strongest pot you were ever going to smoke. And that was also the night I met Doug Rushkoff, and I really like his writing very, very much. And I really like what he has to say about what's been happening to our culture and technology. So he's Doug Rushkoff and Terrence McKenna are sort of early people that I read. Um, and Andy Weil, I really liked his book Natural Mind. I thought it was great. He's still somebody I really look up to quite a bit. Michael Backus I like for cannabis information, Backes. Stan Groff is a classic place to learn about mystical experiences, but some of the newer books like Bill Richards' Sacred Knowledge, or Jim Fadiman, I think also, Jim Fadiman's doing a lot of the microdosing work. We didn't really talk about microdosing, but I do talk about it in Good Chemistry and try to break it down a little bit. What the two protocols are. Paul Stamets has a microdose protocol, and Jim Fadiman does. So I talk about that in Good Chemistry. Finally got to meet Paul Stamets at Esalen a year ago. I mean, he's somebody I'd heard about forever. And it was like just as good as as you could have wanted it to be. He really is. He was a bit like a superhero. And he's really helping to save the bee population. So I would love to give a shout out to Paul Stamets and his work with the bees.
That's a great rundown of people. For anyone out there who wants to learn more, it is, reading the books, going to the conferences and the online lectures. And now you have a new book that's really excellent to help you understand all of this. Good Chemistry, The Science of Connection, From Soul to Psychedelics.
Wait, I gotta say one more thing, Lex. Sorry, but I just feel like, did I just list a bunch of men? Because how dare me? So I have to say. So I would also like to add chacruna.net, which is Bia Labache, who is a real worldwide expert on ayahuasca. And also, I have been. I met a lot of really great women at Esalen too, and there's sort of a growing cohesion around the women of psychedelic science and the women of psychedelic research. One of the things I tried to do in Good Chemistry was include a lot of these women. So Catherine McLean was interviewed for the book, and Gul Dolan, who's doing really interesting MDMA research. She's the one who gave MDMA to octopuses, but she also showed this critical learning period, this sort of adolescent plastic brain that happens with MDMA. So that's Gul Dolan's work is really important to me. And this woman, Harriet Schellenkens, who was the one who discovered that the 5-HT2A receptor, which is sort of the psychedelic receptor, and the oxytocin receptor, that these two receptors actually dimerize and form a receptor pair, a receptor complex, a dimer. So that's really important research. So there's a lot of women now, Rosalind Watts is another person, and she's also in Good Chemistry. I really tried to get to hear from more of the women in the book. And there are men too, but it's just, I spoke up at Esalen and sort of said, I know that there's so many women out here, but I feel like whenever you see a documentary or you read a book, it's all these men and it's all these white men, and we definitely desperately need more people of color in the psychedelic community. Both as clinicians and administrators, but also as research subjects and patients. It's very white right now, and it's also very male, but it's not only male. And so it was really important to me to just go the extra tiny little step to find women to interview and talk about these issues. They're out there. So yes, I've said my piece.
It's an excellent array of women. I definitely noticed that. And in fact,
good.
The last organization I would mention would be the Women's Visionary Council as well.
Yes.
Community of Psychedelic Women. And to me, it's fascinating as someone who's been listening to a bunch of lectures at all these different places is, in general, how much better women are about talking about this. Something about femininity seems
exactly. Right. I mean, it's if I see another documentary, about hallucinogens or whatever people are going to call them, and it's just all the same 3 or 4 white guys. It's just just dig a little deeper. It's not that hard. Behind every man is about 3 or 4 women with a PhD doing the lion's share of the work and not getting the credit. And we're sick of it. I mean, it really reminded me, I said this at Esalen, I actually got kind of choked up talking about it, but me crying in public, not that uncommon. And I said, it kind of feels to me, when I watch these documentaries and it's all the men, it's just the women, were in the background, cooking the meal and doing the dishes, and the men are sort of in the dining room, puffing on their cigars, patting their bellies, but that's where the cameras are, it's like there's a lot of work being done behind the scenes by women, and they're just not getting their due. They're not getting the credit and the exposure that they deserve. So that was really important to me with Good Chemistry, that I sort of right that wrong a little bit.
And you certainly did. For everyone listening, it's a great addition to the field and a great way to learn about connection and psychedelics. The book is Good Chemistry, The Science of Connection from Soul to Psychedelics. And I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Julie Holland for sharing with us today.
Absolutely my pleasure, Lex, anytime.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to add something special at the end of the show. One of the things I really like about Julie's book and her writing in general is how practical they are and how much advice she puts in that you can start using right away. And so she gave us permission to add her 7 tips from her book, Good Chemistry, about how to flip over into the parasympathetic mode, the more heart-opening mode versus the sympathetic mode of fight or flight. And so the easiest way, number 1 on her list, is breathing. And it's breathing through your nose with a longer exhale and an inhale. Apparently that's a big deal, and you see it a lot in the history of breathing techniques. But simply that, stopping and breathing with longer exhales can help calm your body down in a lot of ways. The second tip also involves breathing. It's breathing through the left nostril. And there's actually a bunch of peer-reviewed studies about how breathing through the left nostril and all of these different measures helps to elevate your parasympathetic response. And so it is seen as the cooling side of breathing, while your right nostril is seen as the heating side of breathing. So if you want to cool down, breathing through your left nostril can be really helpful. Tip number 3 is probably going to be the hardest for everybody. Tip number 3 is do nothing. Just sit, drop what you're doing, put your phone away, and just sit and be. I know it sounds terrible, but apparently it's really good for you, and I'm trying to do a little bit more of it myself. Number 4 is also somewhat of a tough one. Do some yoga. It unifies the mind and the body, and it kind of yokes your breathing to your heart rate, to your respiratory control, and to your body control. And it's one of the reasons yoga just helps to center people more than just the good things it does for your body. It does a lot of good stuff for your mind, apparently. Tip number 5 is more fun. It is singing. It doesn't matter what kind of singing you do, whether it be lullabies or death metal, singing in general, you're breathing longer on your exhale. So it's kind of a cheat to get your breathing correct or in a helpful parasympathetic way. Number 6 is floating. And this could be floating in a pool or in a tub. But one of the very best ways would be in a float tank. And we're going to interview some float tank people on this show for sure. But being able to float in a sensory deprivation tank is an amazing thing. There's all kinds of studies about it. And apparently simply floating in any kind of lake, any body of water in a heart open position with your arms spread wide open, it kind of makes it impossible for you to be in flight or fight mode. Because you're so open, you just feel more relaxed. And so floating with your arms wide is a really helpful thing we can do for ourselves. And the last one is one I've only heard about a little bit. It's called havening. And it's actually a body touch technique. It's a self-soothing technique. And you cross your arms like you're hugging yourself, and then you stroke your upper arms downward from the shoulder to the elbow over and over again. It's pretty straightforward. If you want to see videos about it, there's a lot of them online. But for some reason, this does a lot to soothe the body and to lessen anxiety. And so there are 7 tips for activating your parasympathetic system from Dr. Julie Holland's Good Chemistry, The Science of Connection, from Soul to Psychedelics. Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, find us at pluscbdoil.com/Lex Files. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com. If you enjoyed the program, please rate us on iTunes and share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. Our chief advisor is Amabel Dela Cruz. The music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. Our sponsor is CV Sciences, maker of America's favorite CBD oil. And remember the coupon code LEXFILES. I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.